The aircraft cabin hummed with the familiar rhythm of air travel, the low drone of engines, the occasional rattle of turbulence, and the quiet shuffle of passengers finding comfort in cramped seats. For most, it was an ordinary flight, a forgettable link between departure and arrival. But for the woman in seat 7A, it was a rare chance to slip into anonymity, to exist without scrutiny or expectation. She appeared no different than the dozens of others around her. A paperback novel rested open on her lap, her eyes moving steadily across the page. To anyone glancing her way, she was just another passenger whiling away the hours with fiction. Her appearance was deceptively simple. Dark hair tucked behind her ears, travel clothes chosen more for practicality than style jeans, a plain shirt, and a jacket light enough to fold beneath the seat. Her posture was relaxed, but not careless. Her body language gave off no signal of agitation or excitement. If anything, she looked like a frequent flyer, the kind who had long since grown numb to the cramped aisles and recycled air. Nothing about her stood out. And that was precisely the point. The novel in her hands was less about entertainment and more about camouflage. She hardly registered the words. Instead, her senses absorbed the cabin environment. The faint hiss of oxygen circulation, the hushed laughter of two college students across the aisle, the sharp click of a businessman's laptop keyboard 3 rows ahead. It was habit, drilled into her over years of service. Even now, living in civilian life, she couldn't switch it off. The world had taught her one truth. Danger never announced itself with a warning. Still, she hadn't boarded the flight expecting trouble. She had booked it last minute, a straightforward hop across the country. No headlines, no classified orders, no team waiting on the other side. Just a quiet trip. That was the life she had promised herself when she left the Marines. A life where missions weren't written in encrypted files, but in grocery lists. Where a weapon wasn't strapped to her thigh, but locked away in memory. The seatbelt light blinked off, and passengers began to settle into routines. A mother coaxed her restless toddler with snacks. An elderly man adjusted his hearing aid and leaned back with a sigh. A pair of young professionals in crisp suits debated which wine to order when drink service began. It was a portrait of normalcy, and she allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to believe she truly was part of it. She shifted slightly, tucking one leg beneath her, and angled the book to catch the overhead light. The title was an old favorite, a detective story she had read years before. She chose it deliberately. Rereading something familiar meant her mind could drift without losing the thread. Her eyes moved over the paragraphs, but her thoughts traveled elsewhere. She remembered nights under desert stars, lying awake in silence while her team rotated watch. She remembered the sound of radios crackling with coded phrases. She remembered the call sign, the 2 short words that had followed her through missions like a shadow. Even now, years later, it clung to her identity, burned into her memory. She hated how it lingered, as though it belonged to her more than her own name. The flight attendant paused by her row with a practiced smile. "Would you like a drink?" "Water, please." Her voice was steady, unremarkable. Coming right up, the attendant moved on, and the woman returned to her page. She preferred water on flights. Alcohol dulled reflexes, and reflexes had kept her alive too many times to risk softening them. Even now, in a place where danger felt unlikely, the discipline held. Some habits couldn't be broken. Across the aisle, a boy no older than 12 sneaked curious glances at her book. She caught his eyes once, offered the faintest smile, then returned to her reading. To him, she was simply a stranger with an old-fashioned taste in novels. He couldn't know that her quiet demeanor hid years of training, battles, and scars invisible beneath travel clothes. That was the beauty of her seat, her posture, her book. She was invisible. And invisibility was survival. She turned another page, absorbing none of it, her mind drifting to the contrast of her two lives. Civilian life felt fragile, like glass. It offered freedom, but also unease. When she had been deployed, danger was expected, anticipated, prepared for. Civilian life offered no such clarity. It was chaos hidden under routine. A fender bender could be more threatening than an ambush. A stranger's stare in a grocery line could rattle her nerves more than a firefight. Out here, danger wasn't predictable. It lurked in the ordinary. The overhead speaker chimed, breaking her thoughts. The captain's voice came through, calm and cheerful, announcing smooth weather ahead and an on-time arrival. A ripple of relief passed through the cabin. No delays, no storms. Passengers relaxed further, leaning into their journeys. She nodded absently and adjusted her seat. The tray table rattled as the flight attendant returned with her water. "Here you go." "Thank you." She accepted the cup with a polite nod, careful not to reveal how she scanned the attendant's hands, her movement, her composure. Old instincts again. Always scanning. Always reading. She sipped slowly, eyes drifting back to the page. Her heart rate was steady, her breathing calm. On the surface, she was exactly what she wanted to be. Anonymous, invisible, forgettable. A woman traveling alone, passing time with a book. Yet beneath the calm, her subconscious ticked like a clock. Every detail logged. Every sound processed. Every movement noted. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. The Marine in her never fully retired. Row by row, the cabin settled. The hum of engines grew soothing, a backdrop to the ordinary rituals of flight. Conversation softened, trays clicked into place, and yawns spread among weary travelers. The boy across the aisle had given up his curious glances, and now leaned against his mother's shoulder, drifting toward sleep. She allowed herself one long exhale. For now, this was peace. Not the battlefield kind, where peace was temporary and fragile, but the civilian kind, messy, unstructured, imperfect, yet real. She clung to it like a lifeline. She needed it. She wanted it. Her book slipped slightly in her hands, her eyes finally catching on the printed words. She let herself fall into the story. Just for a moment, she wasn't a Marine. She wasn't a veteran of Force Recon. She wasn't a survivor of missions unspoken and battles unnamed. She was simply a woman on a plane, reading a novel, waiting to land. And then, somewhere deep in the recesses of her mind, the Marine whispered the truth she already knew. Peace never lasted. The transition from calm to chaos happened with brutal suddenness. One moment, the cabin buzzed with the quiet rituals of travel seatbelt clicks, hushed conversations, the faint laughter of two college students behind row 10. The next, a voice barked from the front, sharp and commanding, cutting through the drone of the engines. "Stay in your seats." Gasps rippled through the rows. At first, passengers assumed it was an unruly traveler, some fool drunk before takeoff. But then came the sight that erased all doubt. A man lunging forward, his jacket flaring open to reveal the unmistakable glint of a weapon crude, but lethal in such confined space. The world inside the aircraft tilted. A second man rose from row 12, brandishing a knife, his face hard, his eyes darting. A third appeared from the rear, blocking the aisle with terrifying confidence. They moved with purpose, their timing rehearsed. This wasn't random rage. This was an operation. Panic erupted. A woman screamed, her voice high and ragged. Children cried, parents clutched them tightly. A businessman tried to stand, only to be shoved back down by a hijacker's fist. The atmosphere of the cabin transformed instantly, no longer the sterile monotony of travel, but a cage of fear suspended thousands of feet in the sky. And yet, in seat 7A, she did not scream. She did not fumble for her phone or clutch the armrest in desperation. Instead, she watched. Her eyes, calm and precise, locked onto the movements of the three men. She measured their coordination, their weapons, their tone. She registered their accents, not local, not uniform, but familiar to her trained ear. Every detail was a clue, every gesture a signal. Her book lay forgotten in her lap. She didn't need it now. The Marine within her, dormant for so long, stirred awake. The leader of the group moved forward, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, his voice booming with authority. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks unless spoken to. His knife gleamed under the fluorescent cabin lights. The passengers shrank into silence, the weight of their fear pressing them into seats. From her position, she studied his gait, his body language. He wasn't improvising. He was used to giving orders. His stance carried discipline. That made him dangerous. The second hijacker, the one in the middle rows, appeared less composed. His grip on his weapon was tense, his eyes jittering over the passengers. Nerves, weakness. The third at the back stood firm, broad-shouldered, his arms crossed like a barrier. He was the enforcer. 3 roles. 3 threats. 1 mission. Her heart rate remained steady. Years of training had taught her to find calm where others found terror. But she felt the shift, the familiar hum in her chest, adrenaline sharpening every sense. The first real act of violence came quickly. A passenger, emboldened or panicked, tried to rush forward. The leader's knife slashed through the air, grazing the man's arm. Blood stained his sleeve. The cabin fell into horrified silence. Lesson delivered. She didn't flinch. She observed. Her instincts told her something crucial. This wasn't about random violence. These men wanted control, leverage, power, which meant they needed hostages alive. For now, the flight attendants, trembling, were ordered to sit at the front. One of them glanced back at her row, eyes wide with terror, silently pleading for help from anyone. She returned the gaze with measured calm, though she made no move. Not yet. And then it happened, a moment that shifted everything. The leader's gaze swept the cabin, scanning faces. His eyes landed on her. For a second, his expression remained neutral. Then it changed. His body stiffened. His lips parted slightly, as if he'd seen a ghost. He froze in the aisle, his knife hovering in midair, and whispered something to the hijacker closest to him. The words were low, nearly lost in the cabin's tense silence. But her ears, trained to catch fragments of coded messages in chaos, picked it up. He had spoken her call sign. That cursed name. The one she had buried with her uniform, her missions, her years of service. The one known only to a select circle of Marine Force Recon and the enemies they faced. Her stomach clenched. So that's how it was. The recognition wasn't chance. The scarred leader knew who she was, or at least what she had been. Memories flooded back. Nights under black skies, hostile terrain, missions where failure meant death. She had thought that world was sealed, a past life disconnected from this new existence. But the look in his eyes told her otherwise. The hijacker hissed again, louder this time, the syllables sharp. The other 2 men glanced at her, their expressions hardening. The leader pointed directly at 7, and passengers turned their heads in confusion. To them, she was still invisible, just a woman with a book. But to the hijackers, she had become the most dangerous person on the plane. She didn't move, didn't blink. She simply met the leader's eyes with quiet defiance. Inside, calculations whirred. If they knew her, anonymity was gone. The balance of this hijacking had shifted. The Marine had been exposed. The man who had spoken her call sign now faced a choice. eliminate her quickly to maintain control, or keep her alive as a tool. His hesitation told her what she needed to know. He feared her. The other passengers didn't notice. To them, the tension in the aisle was just more of the nightmare unfolding. But for her, the moment was razor-sharp. The ordinary flight was gone. The book, the quiet, the peace, it was all shattered. The hijackers had revealed themselves. And in doing so, they had awakened the part of her she had tried hardest to bury. She leaned back slowly in her seat, appearing calm. But inside, the Marine in her tightened its grip, ready for what was coming. The hijack had begun. And now it was personal. The air inside the cabin thickened, though the temperature hadn't changed. The hum of the engines continued, steady and unbroken, but for the woman in seat 7A, the atmosphere had turned suffocating. Her heart didn't pound wildly. She had long since trained her body to resist panic, but a new sharpness lit inside her veins. It was the kind of awareness she had only felt in combat zones, that electric current that snapped the world into high definition. The leader's eyes didn't leave her. His scarred cheek twitched as he muttered again to the man nearest him. The second hijacker leaned forward, following his line of sight. When his gaze fell on her, he too stiffened. Passengers craned their necks, following the direction of those hardened stares. To them, it made no sense. She wasn't standing, wasn't protesting, wasn't resisting. She was just a woman with a paperback novel resting in her lap. But something about her presence had rattled the men holding the knives. And then came the sound. The leader whispered her call sign again, this time louder, the syllables sharp and guttural, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. It was unmistakable, a set of coded words she hadn't heard in years, words she had sworn she would never hear again. Her blood chilled. That call sign had followed her through dust storms and jungle rains, whispered into radios during midnight operations, shouted across battlefields when silence was no longer an option. To her, it was a brand she had carried for years, a label that had meant strength, danger, survival. To her enemies, it was something far darker, a curse, a name tied to the missions that had shattered their networks and left scars that never healed. For this man to know it here, on this flight, meant only one thing. Their worlds had crossed before. She remembered flashes. A raid years earlier, a compound swept under moonlight, hostile forces scattered like shadows. She had been younger then, sharper, still convinced she could leave her mark on the world, and then walk away clean. She remembered the chaos of that night gunfire, smoke, the screams of men dragged into custody. She remembered a scarred face in the shadows, barely glimpsed as her team pulled out. Her eyes narrowed now. The leader's scar matched the memory. The realization slammed into her chest. This hijacking wasn't coincidence. At least not for him. He hadn't just seen her. He had recognized her as the enemy who had once brought his world crashing down. For a long moment, neither moved. The cabin existed in a suspended stillness, as though the passengers had collectively stopped breathing. Finally, the scarred leader broke the silence, his voice low, trembling not with fear, but with fury held tightly in check. It's her. The words weren't English, but she didn't need a translation. His body language said it all. The second hijacker's grip tightened on his weapon. The third, at the rear of the cabin, shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see what had disturbed his leader. A ripple of unease spread through their group. They had expected compliance. They had expected fear. What they hadn't expected was her. She closed her book carefully, setting it on the empty seat beside her. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. Panic would only embolden them. Calm would unnerve them. And if they already knew her call sign, the illusion of anonymity was gone. The boy across the aisle, barely 12, innocent eyes wide with terror, watched her. She gave him the faintest nod, a silent reassurance. The boy blinked, confused but steadier. Even in this nightmare, she knew every small gesture mattered. Fear could unravel a cabin faster than violence. The scarred leader hissed something at the others, his eyes never leaving her. The second hijacker muttered a protest, glancing nervously at the rows of passengers watching the exchange. They weren't arguing about whether she was dangerous. They were arguing about what to do with her. She read their body language with precision. One wanted to kill her outright, eliminate the threat before it grew. Another wanted to keep her alive, to use her as leverage, a bargaining chip far more valuable than a random passenger. The leader, though, was torn. His scar burned with old memory, but his discipline warred with his rage. For her, the equation was clear. She couldn't move yet. Not until she knew exactly how they would act. She leaned back in her seat, folding her arms casually, her expression unreadable. Let them stew in their recognition. Let them wonder what she knew, what she could do. The fear in their eyes told her one thing. They weren't as in control as they wanted passengers to believe. Her mind raced with possibilities. Did they know her name, or only her call sign? Did they know her role in the operation that had scarred him, or did they only suspect? Did they know she was unarmed here, stripped of her team, her gear, her backup? The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that they feared her. The leader barked an order suddenly, and the second hijacker strode down the aisle toward her row. Gasps filled the cabin. A woman clutched her child tighter. The former cop, seated only 2 rows away, tensed but forced himself to stay still. He was watching her carefully now, beginning to see there was something about this passenger that didn't fit. The hijacker stopped in front of her. He gestured with his knife, his voice sharp. "Stand, now." She looked up slowly, her eyes calm, unblinking. Then she tilted her head, just enough to show defiance without inviting a blade to her throat. She didn't move. The man's nostrils flared. He barked the order again, louder this time, his knife inches from her face. Around them, passengers whimpered, hands clutched in prayer, breaths held. And still, she did not move. Instead, she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, cutting through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "If you know who I am, then you know what happens if you make the wrong choice." The second hijacker blinked, startled. The scarred leader stiffened, recognition deepening into fury. The passengers didn't understand her words, but they felt the shift, the power sliding subtly away from the men with weapons toward the woman in 7A. For a brief instant, silence reigned again. The hijackers exchanged glances, their confidence shaken. She had given them no name, no detail, just a reminder of their own fear. Inside, she was already planning. If they wanted her alive, that gave her time. If they wanted her dead, that gave her opportunity. Either way, the game had changed. She wasn't an invisible passenger anymore. She was the variable they hadn't accounted for. And in the claustrophobic cage of that aircraft, she knew one truth above all. Once her call sign was spoken aloud, there would be no turning back. The hijack was no longer about hostages and demands. Now it was personal. The aisle had become a battlefield without a shot fired. 3 hijackers, armed and on edge, stood against a cabin of unarmed civilians too terrified to move. And yet, the true center of gravity was not the knives, nor the raised voices, nor the blood already staining a businessman's sleeve. It was the woman in seat 7A. She sat motionless, her arms folded loosely, her book closed on the seat beside her. Her stillness radiated something that unsettled the hijackers more than screams ever could. She looked less like a hostage than a predator biding her time. The scarred leader's voice cut through the cabin. He barked at his men in their native tongue, sharp syllables exchanged with urgency. Passengers shrank deeper into their seats, unable to understand the words, but hearing enough in the tone. Fear, indecision, and anger. The second hijacker wanted her dead. His body language screamed it. His hand twitched on the knife. His eyes darted between her and his leader, impatient for the order to strike. The third, posted at the rear, seemed torn. His gaze lingered on her longer than it should have. He didn't see just a passenger. He saw what his leader saw. Danger. The scarred man himself was caught in conflict. His scar burned like a brand of memory, a constant reminder of the operation that had destroyed his unit, his life. He wanted revenge, yes, but he also wanted control. Killing her too soon might shatter that control. Keeping her alive might cost him everything. She studied them in silence. To the passengers, she looked calm. To the hijackers, she looked unafraid. That calmness was her weapon. In her world, hesitation could mean death, but so could rushing into action before the moment was right. Her mind flashed back ambushes in the jungle, silent nights waiting for the green flare of go in hostile territory. The way her team had communicated with a look, a nod, a flick of fingers. That same discipline anchored her now. She inhaled slowly, deeply, measuring her breath. Her eyes shifted once, carefully, toward the former cop 2 rows away. He was pretending to tremble like the others, but she noticed the subtle clench of his jaw, the flex of his fingers against the armrest. He was waiting for her. He didn't know who she was, but he knew enough. She wasn't ordinary. The boy across the aisle still stared wide-eyed. His mother's arms wrapped protectively around him, but he peeked through the gap, watching her. She gave him another, almost imperceptible nod. He swallowed hard, then buried his face in his mother's shoulder. She had given him the permission to stop watching, permission to be a child again, not a witness to terror. The hijackers' argument grew heated. Their words spilled too fast for most ears to follow, but she caught fragments. Kill, leverage, American military, dangerous. They didn't know whether to erase her or exploit her. She leaned back further in her seat, legs stretched slightly, as though she were merely adjusting for comfort. Every inch of her body screamed composure, though beneath it every muscle coiled tight. The scarred leader turned back to her, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he demanded in accented English. A question for show, not curiosity. He already knew enough. She didn't answer. She only held his gaze, calm and unblinking. The silence was heavier than words. It unsettled him more than any denial would have. Passengers fidgeted nervously. A man coughed. A woman sobbed softly into her sleeve. The cabin was suffocating in its silence, broken only by the hijackers' breathing and the faint drone of the engines. The leader hissed another order. The second hijacker stepped closer, knife raised, fury etched on his face. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered, low enough for only him to hear, "You don't want to try." The man froze. His hand trembled for a fraction of a second. Her voice had landed like a blade against his throat, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. He glanced at his leader for direction. The scarred man clenched his jaw, veins tightening in his neck. He hated that she had turned the moment around. He hated more that his men had felt it. Passengers were watching now, though they didn't understand the exchange. They only saw the impossible. A lone woman, unarmed, staring down armed hijackers, and somehow holding her ground. Whispers began, nervous but awed. "Who is she?" The leader barked again, louder this time, commanding his men to return to positions. Reluctantly, the second hijacker stepped back, though his glare promised he would not wait forever. The standoff eased by an inch, but the cabin's tension only grew. She allowed herself the smallest breath of relief, but not enough to ease her posture. This wasn't victory. It was a delay. She knew how men like them thought. They would argue, they would scheme, but eventually they would decide. And when they did, the knife would come back to her throat. She had to be ready. Her thoughts sharpened into planning. 3 of them armed. Dozens of passengers, terrified, but potentially useful. 1 former cop she could trust for backup. The flight attendants nervous, but brave if guided. The boy too young to involve. She dismissed him from her mental battlefield. The environment itself, narrow aisles, overhead bins, seatbelts, trays, bottles, belts. Every object was a tool, every surface a weapon. Years of improvisation in the field had taught her that anything could become leverage. Her pulse slowed further. She was settling into the rhythm she knew best, preparation before action. The scarred leader stared at her once more, then turned away with a snarl. He wasn't finished with her, not by a long shot. But for now, he needed to maintain control of the cabin. His rage would have to wait. The woman in 7A closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She hadn't wanted this life anymore. She had walked away, built walls between herself and the past. But those walls were paper thin, and fate had burned them down in seconds. She opened her eyes again, gaze steady, shoulders square. The passengers saw calm. The hijackers saw defiance. Inside, she knew the truth. The standoff would not last forever. One way or another, the storm was coming. And when it broke, she would be ready. The air inside the cabin had grown thick with fear. Every breath carried the weight of dread. Every cough or whimper risked drawing attention from the armed men pacing the aisle. Yet amid that suffocating atmosphere, something subtle had shifted. The woman in 7A wasn't simply enduring anymore. She was beginning to shape the battlefield. The hijackers didn't know it yet, but their grip on control was weakening with each passing minute. Watching the cracks form, she sat still, but her eyes never rested. Years of reconnaissance had trained her to see not just what was obvious, but what was hidden. She noticed how the second hijacker's hands twitched on the knife, his agitation betraying nerves. His movements were jerky, impulsive. He was dangerous, yes, but predictable. The third, guarding the rear, shifted his weight constantly from one foot to the other. Fatigue, impatience, doubt, they all leaked through his posture. He avoided her gaze, which told her everything. His loyalty to the cause was weaker than his loyalty to survival. The scarred leader was the true threat. He kept his men aligned, his voice cutting through the cabin like a whip. He noticed too much, missed too little. He had faced soldiers before, and he carried himself like someone who had survived chaos more than once. But even leaders crack under pressure. She had to find his crack. The first move when the flight attendant shuffled down the aisle with trembling hands, offering water to the hijackers, she saw her chance. The scarred leader waved her away impatiently, but the second hijacker grabbed a bottle, tearing off the cap and drinking greedily. He spilled some down his chin, cursing, then threw the bottle aside. The plastic rolled across the floor, bumping against her boot. She bent to pick it up. A small gesture, so ordinary it might have been overlooked. But the scarred leader saw it. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. She met his stare deliberately, holding the bottle in her hand. Then slowly, she set it on the tray beside her book, as if to say, "I'm not hiding. I'm not rushing. I'm just here." To the untrained eye, it was nothing. But to him, it was a challenge cloaked as submission. He barked at her in his language, sharp words she couldn't fully catch but understood by tone. "Stay still. Don't test me." She didn't respond. She had already tested him, and he had responded. The balance of control had tilted a fraction. A silent ally, the former cop 2 rows back, noticed too. His eyes flicked toward her, then away quickly. His breathing had steadied, no longer the panicked rasp of a trapped man. He was watching, waiting. She shifted slightly in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. Her right hand tapped once against her thigh, a movement so casual most would dismiss it. But to a trained eye, it was a signal. I'm ready. Stay alert. The cop stiffened almost imperceptibly. Message received. Now, it wasn't just her against 3 men. It was her and an ally one who might be able to act when the moment came. Building tension minutes dragged on, stretching thin like wire, ready to snap. The hijackers barked at passengers, ordering silence, demanding compliance. But even as they tried to project dominance, their control wavered. The second hijacker snapped at an elderly man for shifting in his seat, shoving him roughly. Passengers gasped, fear rippling through the cabin. But in their eyes, something else sparked to anger. Fear could unite, but anger could ignite. The woman in 7A felt it building, subtle but real. The passengers weren't yet a mob, but they were no longer helpless sheep either. If the spark came, they could become a storm. She needed that storm. But it had to be controlled, or chaos would kill more than it saved. The drink spill her chance came when a flight attendant stumbled, tray in hand, nearly dropping the drinks. One plastic cup tipped, spilling soda down the aisle. Passengers murmured nervously. The second hijacker cursed again, distracted as he tried to avoid the spill on his shoes. She moved. Not with violence, not yet. Just a small, deliberate action. She leaned down, pulling a napkin from the attendant's tray, and dabbed at the spill near her feet. Sit down. The second hijacker snapped, lunging toward her with his knife. But before he could close the distance, the leader's voice cut through the tension like steel. Enough! The scarred man yanked his subordinate back, fury blazing in his eyes, not at her, but at his own man. His authority had been challenged by the chaos of spilled soda, and he would not allow disorder. The woman in 7A leaned back in her seat, napkin still in hand, calm as stone. She had accomplished exactly what she wanted. The hijackers had turned their focus inward, their unity fraying further. A game of patience time was her ally, but also her enemy. The longer the plane stayed in the air, the more desperate the hijackers would become. Desperation meant mistakes, but it also meant blood. She had to walk the razor's edge, eroding their control without pushing them to the breaking point too soon. Her breathing slowed. She cataloged her options. Improvised weapons, the bottle, the metal buckle of her belt, even the hard spine of her book. Allies, the cop, maybe a few strong passengers if they could overcome their fear. Obstacles, the narrow aisle, the sharp panic of civilians, the hijackers' knives. Every factor weighed and balanced, like pieces on a chessboard. The scarred leader caught her staring again. He sneered, leaning close enough that only she could hear. You think you can win, he whispered. But this is not your war anymore. She tilted her head slightly, voice calm and cool. You're right. It's yours to lose. His eyes flared with anger. He pulled back, barking another order to his men. But she saw it now clear as day. His crack. His pride. If she could keep pressing, keep pushing him off balance, he would make the mistake she needed. Subtle command. She glanced once more toward the cop. This time, her fingers drummed twice on the armrest. A different signal. His eyes widened slightly. He understood. Wait. Watch. Be ready. For the first time since the hijacking began, the woman in 7A felt the tide shifting. Not by force, not by violence, but by patience, presence, and precision. The hijackers still held the knives. They still held the threat, but control the true weapon was slipping from their grasp and into hers. The woman in 7A had always lived by a rule that every Marine Force Recon operator learned early. Sometimes survival isn't about the bigger weapon, but the smarter move. It wasn't strength that tipped battles, it was timing. And her instincts told her the time was coming. Reading the temperature, the hijackers were unraveling. The scarred leader still barked commands with the sharp edge of authority, but the strain in his voice was audible. His men weren't machines. They were nervous, restless, impulsive. The second hijacker, the one with the twitching hands, looked ready to lash out at anything that moved. The third, near the rear, had begun to avoid even his leader's gaze, shrinking into himself as though the weight of the cabin's fear pressed heavier on him than the knife he carried. And the passengers, terrified, exhausted, were showing signs of something new. A spark. Their eyes lingered longer on the hijackers, less with panic now and more with anger. The silence wasn't just submission anymore. It was pressure building. If she waited too long, the spark might explode into chaos, random, uncontrolled, dangerous. Civilians charging 3 armed men without direction would be slaughtered. She needed to ignite it herself, but on her terms. A quiet test, she started small. Her hand reached for the water bottle on her tray, the same one that had rolled her way earlier. She unscrewed the cap slowly, movements casual, as though she were nothing more than a thirsty passenger trying to ease her dry throat. The second hijacker caught the motion. His head snapped around, eyes narrowing. No! He barked, stepping toward her, knife flashing. The scarred leader raised a hand, halting him. Let her. A strange grin tugged at the leader's mouth, as if daring her. She lifted the bottle, took a single sip, then placed it deliberately back on the tray. No rush, no fear. It was nothing. A drink of water. But in that nothingness lay the test. The passengers had seen it. She could feel their eyes on her, the ripple of shock and awe in the silence. She had acted when no one else dared. The hijackers had seen it too. For the leader, it was a game of control. For his men, it was confusion. Why was he allowing her defiance? For her, it was a line drawn in the sand. She could move. She could act. And nothing had stopped her. The spilled coffee minutes passed. The hum of the engine seemed louder, like the steady drumbeat of a countdown. Then came her chance. The flight attendant, still trembling, shuffled down the aisle again with a tray of coffee. Her hands shook so badly that one cup tipped, spilling hot liquid across the floor near row 6. Passengers gasped, recoiling as the coffee spread. The second hijacker cursed, jerking back to avoid the spill. His distraction was instant, his grip on the knife loosening for just a heartbeat. She moved. Her hand darted out, not toward him, but toward the tray. She snatched a napkin, crouched slightly, and dabbed at the spill near her feet. Sit down. The hijacker roared, lunging forward. His knife gleamed, his temper finally boiling over. But once again, the scarred leader barked sharply in their language, yanking his man back. His voice was full of fury, not at her, but at his subordinate. Order had cracked, just a little more. And she had learned something critical. The second hijacker could be baited. His temper was a weapon she could turn against him. A signal to the cop, she leaned back in her seat, napkin still in hand, and let her eyes flick toward the former cop. He was ready. She could see it in the way his shoulders had squared, the tension in his jaw. Her fingers tapped twice on the armrest. Soon. He gave no visible response, but she knew he'd caught it. Her team was forming silent, invisible, but real. The child's cry, the boy across the aisle whimpered suddenly, burying his face against his mother's shoulder. The sound was small, human, heartbreaking in its innocence. The mother whispered soothing words, but the second hijacker snapped his head toward them, knife raising again. Rage flared in her chest. If he touched the boy, she would act risk or no risk. But she forced herself to breathe, to calculate. A premature move could doom them all. She couldn't let rage dictate the timing. Not yet. Instead, she leaned subtly forward, eyes locked on the second hijacker, voice low and calm. "Touch him," she whispered, "and you won't live to regret it." The man froze. He understood enough English, and her tone needed no translation. His face twisted with fury, but his steps faltered. He looked to his leader for direction. The scarred man gave none. He only glared at her, the corner of his mouth twitching with frustration. The control of the cabin, the fear that should have belonged solely to the hijackers, was bleeding away, drop by drop, into her hands. Weighing the risk, she knew she couldn't keep pushing forever. Each act of defiance brought her closer to the edge. Eventually, they would snap, and when they did, there would be no more warnings. That was the risk she had to calculate, how far she could push without breaking the balance too soon. Every mission she had ever survived came down to this kind of judgment, reading the enemy, knowing when to hold and when to strike. And her instincts told her the window was narrowing, creating the distraction. Her next move would be deliberate, dangerous, but necessary. She reached for her drink again, this time tilting the bottle just enough to spill a thin stream of water across her tray table and onto her lap. Passengers turned their heads, startled by the sudden movement. The hijackers snapped to attention, eyes narrowing. She stood halfway, blotting at her clothes with a napkin, muttering, "Damn it." It was small, ordinary, but it was movement, and in that moment of surprise, the cabin shifted. Passengers murmured, some standing slightly to avoid the spill, the noise rising. The hijackers shouted, trying to restore silence. Their voices cracked with urgency. And for the first time, the balance of fear had tilted. It wasn't just the hijackers commanding the space anymore. It was her. A moment after she sank back into her seat, water still dripping from her clothes, napkin clutched in her hand. Her face was calm, but inside her blood surged with adrenaline. The risk had worked. She had disrupted their rhythm, forced them to react to her instead of the other way around. The passengers had seen it too. The woman in 7A wasn't afraid, and neither were they, not entirely. The scarred leader's eyes burned into her. She had challenged him openly now, not with fists or weapons, but with control. He leaned down, his scarred face close to hers, voice a venomous hiss. "You are making a mistake." Her reply was steady, ice cold. "So are you." Their war had begun not of knives or fists, not yet, but of will. And in that war, she had just taken the first real victory. The standoff wasn't over. It was only tightening. But now, the passengers weren't just watching her. They were depending on her, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that when the moment came to strike, she wouldn't be striking alone. The cabin had been stretched like a wire strung too tight, humming with tension. Every second brought the risk that it would snap. The woman in 7A knew it. The passengers felt it. Even the hijackers sensed it. And then, like all storms, it broke. The spark it began with the second hijacker, the one with the twitching hands, the one who had been baited again and again. He snapped. A man in row 9 coughed just a cough, nothing more, but the hijacker whirled as if the sound were defiance itself. He stormed down the aisle, knife raised, screaming at the poor passenger to shut up. The man threw his hands up in terror. That was the moment she had been waiting for. Her body moved before thought. She rose from 7A in one fluid motion, as silent and sudden as a coiled spring released. The first strike, her hand shot forward, grabbing the water bottle from her tray. With a flick of her wrist, she hurled it at the hijacker's head. It struck with a hollow thud, snapping his attention away for the fraction of a second she needed. She lunged, crossing the narrow aisle in 2 steps, her body low and fast. Her shoulder slammed into his midsection, driving him backward against the seats. The knife flashed, but her other hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting with brutal precision. A crack echoed bone or tendon, she couldn't tell. The knife clattered to the floor. Passengers gasped, some screaming, others frozen in disbelief. She didn't stop. She pivoted, dragging the hijacker into the aisle, slamming his face against an armrest. Blood spattered. He went limp for a moment, stunned. Her training had taken over, cold and efficient. No hesitation. No mercy. The leader reacts, the scarred leader roared, fury igniting. He shoved through the aisle toward her, knife raised, eyes blazing with murderous intent. But she had all eyes now. The former cop surged up from his seat, slamming his shoulder into the leader's side. The knife slashed downward, grazing the cop's arm but missing the kill. The 2 men grappled, grunting, struggling for control. Passengers screamed louder, some ducking, some rising. The cabin had become chaos incarnate. Improvised weapons. She seized the fallen knife, spinning on the second hijacker who was struggling to rise. With one swift kick to his ribs, she sent him sprawling again. Another passenger, a burly construction worker, leapt from his seat and stomped down on the man's wrist, pinning him. The woman in 7A tossed the knife backward toward the cop. "Use it," she barked, her voice sharp, commanding. The cop caught it awkwardly, but the weapon in his hand gave him the edge he needed. He slashed at the leader's arm, forcing him back, blood spraying. The tide was turning. The third hijacker at the rear. The third hijacker finally reacted. His knife rose, his eyes wild as he shouted and shoved passengers aside, forcing his way forward. But fear had transformed. Passengers didn't shrink back this time. Hands grabbed at him, one man yanking his sleeve, a woman pulling his arm, another slamming a laptop bag against his head. He thrashed violently, cutting a seat cushion, nicking a man's shoulder, but he couldn't move freely. The mob slowed him, dragged him, swallowed him. The woman in 7A saw it in a glance. The third was no longer a threat to her. He was drowning in the storm of passengers who had finally snapped. The duel in the aisle, her focus returned to the leader. The scarred man had thrown the cop aside, blood streaking down his arm, but his knife was still in play. His eyes locked on her with venomous hatred. "You," he spat, voice thick with rage. "You ruin everything." She squared herself, stanced steady in the narrow aisle. "I told you," she said, voice low and calm. "This isn't your war to win," he charged. Their clash was violent, brutal. He slashed at her midsection, but she twisted, the blade grazing her side. Pain flared hot, but she ignored it. Her hand shot forward, striking his wrist, forcing the knife upward. They grappled, bodies colliding against seatbacks, passengers screaming around them. His strength was raw, desperate. Hers was precise, honed, controlled. She used the environment slamming his hand against a metal armrest, ramming his shoulder into a tray table, driving her knee into his ribs. The knife wavered. He snarled, trying to bring it down on her throat. Her elbow shot up, connecting with his jaw. His head snapped back. She twisted, wrenching his wrist, until at last the knife fell free. She caught it mid-drop, reversed the grip, and held it steady against his throat. The cabin froze. The shift of power for a moment, silence reigned. The only sounds were heavy breathing, muffled sobs, the steady thrum of engines. The leader's chest heaved, sweat and blood mixing on his scarred face. His men were finished, one unconscious, the other pinned by furious passengers. He looked at her, eyes burning with hatred and disbelief. "You should have stayed dead," he hissed. She pressed the blade closer, her voice sharp as steel. "And you should have stayed off this plane." Passengers erupted cheers, cries, shouts of relief. Some wept openly, hugging one another. Others pounded the seats, venting fear that had been caged too long. But she didn't let go. Not yet. She knew better than to assume the fight was over. Securing the threats, ropes, belts, anything, she ordered, voice carrying authority. Passengers scrambled, tearing seatbelts, yanking cords from bags, handing them over. The cop, clutching his bleeding arm, helped bind the leader's wrists behind his back. Others secured the unconscious hijacker and the one still struggling at the rear. The hijackers were down. The passengers were in control. And she, still steady, still cold, was the reason why. After the storm, the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Passengers looked at her with awe, gratitude, fear. To them, she was no longer the quiet woman reading in 7A. She was something else entirely, something dangerous, something necessary. The boy peeked from his mother's arms again, eyes wide. This time, when she gave him the smallest nod, it wasn't to tell him to hide. It was to tell him, "It's over. You're safe." The cop leaned against a seat, blood soaking his sleeve, giving her a tired, grateful smile. "I don't know who the hell you are," he said, voice rough, "but I'm glad you were on this flight." She didn't answer. She only sat back down in 7A, knife still in hand, breathing steady. She had done what she came to do, not by choice, not by desire, but because she had no other option. And yet she knew it wasn't fully over. The plane still had miles to go before landing. Authorities would swarm. Questions would come. But for now, for this suspended moment in the sky, the war was hers. And she had won. The plane hummed steadily, but the tension that had gripped it for hours had finally begun to loosen. Outside the cabin windows, the clouds drifted by as if oblivious to the violence and terror that had erupted inside. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, fear, and relief. The hijackers were restrained, their knives and weapons neutralized. Corded together with belts, cords, and ropes passengers had scrambled to find. They were no longer threats, just captured men, defeated and helpless. The passengers sat, slumped in their seats, some hugging one another, others weeping quietly. Their eyes kept darting to the woman in 7A, the silent architect of their survival. She remained seated, knife resting on her lap, posture calm, composed, her face betraying none of the adrenaline that still coursed through her veins. Immediate relief, the former cop leaned against a seat near the front, blood still soaking through his sleeve, but his breathing had finally steadied. He gave her a tired smile, one that carried gratitude, awe, and an unspoken question. "Who are you?" She merely shook her head slightly, letting him draw his own conclusions. Some things weren't for civilians to understand. The boy across the aisle clutched his mother's arm, peering at her through wide, tear-streaked eyes. She gave him a gentle nod, the smallest motion of reassurance that said, "You're safe now." Other passengers whispered among themselves, realizing the woman who had been quietly reading was the reason they were still alive. Murmurs of awe traveled down the cabin like electricity. She wasn't just a passenger. She had become a force, a guardian, an unspoken protector in the chaos. Regaining composure, she leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for the first time since the hijacking began. Her mind, however, didn't rest. She cataloged everything: the positions of the hijackers, their movements, the injuries sustained by passengers, the subtle cues that had indicated when each man would break. Years of training as a Marine Force Recon operative had made her methodical, even in life-threatening chaos. The battlefield never truly ended in her mind until all threats were neutralized and all lives accounted for. Even now, adrenaline still hummed in her veins, keeping her alert. She wasn't done analyzing. Authorities arrived minutes later. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have notified law enforcement and will be landing shortly. Please remain seated. Help is on the way." The cabin erupted into murmurs of relief and soft sobs. Some passengers reached for their phones, calling loved ones. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the tension drain out with deep breaths. The hijackers glanced around, panic finally overtaking their composure. Their leader's glare found her briefly, filled with hatred and disbelief, before he realized he was powerless, restrained, and utterly defeated. Internal reflection. She watched the scene quietly, processing everything in silence. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what could have happened, of what almost did. Each life saved had come at the cost of risking her own. Each act of defiance, each calculated move, had balanced on a knife's edge. She thought back to her days in the corps, to missions under moonlight, to operations where the margin for error had been almost non-existent. Nothing she had faced in the field had felt quite like this, not because of danger, but because this time the civilians' lives were at stake, and failure would have left dozens dead, not just her own team. Yet she also recognized something else. Despite the chaos, despite the terror, she had adapted. She had reclaimed the skills she thought she'd left behind. She had acted decisively, strategically, and ruthlessly when required. Acknowledgement. The former cop approached, his steps tentative. He hesitated near her seat, then spoke quietly, voice raw from the adrenaline and fear that still clung to him. I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't." He trailed off, the meaning clear. She gave a faint nod, voice calm and measured. "You don't need to. Just make sure you tell the truth about what happened." He nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. This wasn't about praise. It was about responsibility. She had done what needed to be done. No more, no less. Passenger reactions around the cabin. Passengers were slowly regaining composure. Some whispered words of gratitude, some simply stared in awe. They had witnessed courage in its rawest form, not the dramatized heroics of movies, but real, calculated bravery that had saved their lives. One elderly woman reached toward her seat, trembling. You saved us," she whispered, voice quivering. She shook her head slightly, offering only a small, reassuring smile. "We saved ourselves," she said. The words weren't false. In the moments when fear could have overtaken them, they had followed her lead. The cabin was alive with a strange, fragile energy, relief, fear, awe, and gratitude interwoven into one tense, lingering heartbeat. Landing the plane touched down smoothly, despite everything. Emergency vehicles lined the runway as the aircraft taxied to a stop. Law enforcement swarmed aboard, quickly assessing the situation and securing the hijackers. Passengers were guided off one by one. Some hugged, others simply collapsed in exhaustion. All eyes, however, kept flicking toward her. She had been a quiet presence among them, almost invisible, until her skill and courage had reshaped the fate of the flight. She remained seated until authorities approached her directly. Calm, poised, composed, she answered their questions succinctly, providing clear information about the hijackers' positions, their weapons, and the timing of their actions. Even now, she exuded control, the same control that had saved the cabin. Personal reflection once outside, the night air hit her like a shock of reality. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her muscles sore, her mind still sharp. She walked slowly, cataloging every detail, replaying every movement. It wasn't vanity. It was habit, ingrained from years of training. She thought about the passengers, the terrified, the grateful, the innocent. About the boy in row 7B, whose small nod had told her more than words ever could. About the former cop, whose quiet readiness had complemented her own precision. And she thought about herself. The life she had tried to leave behind. The Marine, the operative, the survivor, had returned in a moment of necessity. Not by choice, not by desire, but because she had no other option. Yet she also realized something. She could survive this. She could return to a world of calm, of anonymity, of quiet reading. But she would carry this experience with her. Every call sign remembered, every decision made under pressure, every life saved, it would stay. And that was enough. Epilogue: the passengers were escorted to safety. The hijackers were taken into custody, their plans unraveled, their threat neutralized. News crews swarmed the tarmac, helicopters hovering, cameras flashing. Reports of the woman in 7A began to circulate, though most details would remain classified, obscured behind the veil of operational security. She disappeared into the crowd quietly, unnoticed by most. A lone figure among thousands, carrying with her the silent weight of what had transpired, the calm after a storm of violence and fear. But inside, she knew one truth: courage was never loud. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was necessary. And it would always endure. For now, though, she allowed herself one deep breath, one long exhale of relief, one moment of quiet in a world that had demanded everything from her, and she had delivered. The flight was over. But the story of 7A, the woman, who had been reading quietly until recognized by a scarred enemy, would linger, unspoken but unforgettable, in the memories of every passenger who had survived that day.